The world before the Anglo-Saxons. Close your eyes for a moment and let yourself drift back through time. Let the sounds of the modern world fade away, the hum of electricity, the distant traffic, the glow of screens. Let it all dissolve like morning mist, and allow yourself to travel back 1500 years to a land that would one day be called England, but which, in those distant days, had no such name. Picture yourself standing on a windswept shore, somewhere along the eastern coast of Britain. The year is around 410, and the world, as people have known it for centuries, is quietly, irrevocably ending. The Romans are leaving. After nearly 400 years of occupation, the legions are withdrawing, called back to defend a crumbling empire against threats closer to Rome. You watch the last ships disappear over the gray horizon, their red sails growing smaller and smaller until they vanish into the mist. The soldiers who once marched along the straight stone roads, who manned the forts and collected the taxes, they are gone now, and they are never coming back. Stand there for a moment, in the silence they leave behind. Feel the cold wind coming off the North Sea, carrying the smell of salt and seaweed. Behind you, the land stretches out in gentle hills and thick forests, dotted with settlements that have grown comfortable under Roman protection. There are towns with stone walls and heated bathhouses, villas with mosaic floors, where wealthy families have lived in comfort for generations. There are roads that run straight and true from one end of the island to the other, engineering marvels that have made travel and trade possible on a scale never seen before. But now, without the legions to protect them, without the administrators to maintain them, all of these things will slowly begin to fade. The bathhouses will grow cold. The villas will be abandoned, their roofs collapsing inward, their beautiful floors buried under creeping vegetation. The roads will crack and crumble, and the forests will reclaim the land that was once cleared for farming. This is the beginning of a long twilight, a period that later historians will call the Dark Ages, though the people living through it would not have known to call it anything at all. Imagine yourself now as one of those people, farmer, perhaps, or a craftsperson living in a small settlement somewhere in the British countryside. Your grandparents told stories of the Romans, of their power and their order. But you have grown up in a world where that power is only a memory. The stone buildings in the nearby town are crumbling, and no one knows how to repair them. The coins that once made trade so easy are becoming scarce, and people are returning to older ways of exchange, trading goods for goods, favors for favors. Life is not easy, but it is not without its rhythms and its comforts. You rise with the sun and sleep when darkness falls. You tend your crops and your animals. You gather with your neighbors for festivals and for protection. You speak a language that is a blend of the old Celtic tongue and Latin words borrowed from the Romans, a language that shifts and changes with each generation. But there is fear, too, in these uncertain times. Without the legions, the island is vulnerable. From the north come the Picts, fierce warriors who paint their bodies and raid the settlements south of the old wall that the Romans built to keep them out. From the west come the Scots, crossing the sea from Ireland to plunder and sometimes to settle. And from across the cold gray waters of the North Sea come other raiders, Germanic peoples in wooden boats who strike the coastal villages and disappear before Anyone can mount a defense. The kings and chieftains who have risen to fill the void left by the Romans are struggling to protect their people. They fight among themselves as often as they fight against the invaders, each one trying to carve out a kingdom from the chaos. Some of them still cling to the memory of Rome, styling themselves with Latin titles and trying to maintain the old ways. Others have never known anything but this fragmented, uncertain world, and they rule by strength and cunning alone. It is one of these kings, according to the old stories, who will make a decision that changes everything. His name, the legends say, is Vortigern, and he rules over a portion of Britain sometime in the middle of the 5th century, pressed hard by enemies on all sides, desperate for military aid. Vortigern looks across the North Sea to the Germanic lands and sees not just raiders, but potential allies. He sends out a call for mercenaries, offering land in payment in exchange for their swords, and they come. They come in their long wooden ships, with their round shields and their iron weapons, with their strange gods and their guttural language. They come from the lands that will one day be called Denmark and Germany and the Netherlands, from coastal regions where the sea is always rising and the land is never quite enough. They are Angles and Saxons and Jutes, and they are about to change this island forever. But that is a story for the next part of our journey together. For now, rest in this moment of transition, this hinge point in history when one world is ending and another has not yet begun. Feel the uncertainty of it, but also the possibility. The people living through these times did not know what was coming. They could not have imagined that the warriors arriving on their shores would one day give their name to the land itself, that the Angles would become the English and their new home would become England. History rarely announces itself. It creeps in slowly, one small decision at a time, one ship arriving on a misty morning, one handshake between a desperate king and a foreign war leader. The people standing on the shore, watching those ships approach, had no idea that they were witnessing the birth of a new world. They only knew that strangers were coming, and that life, as it always does, would go on. Let yourself linger here for a moment longer, in this space between ages. The Roman world is fading like a dream upon waking, and something new is stirring in the darkness. The forests are deep and full of mystery. The nights are long and lit only by fire and stars, and the future is a blank page waiting to be written. Breathe deeply and let the tension leave your body. You are safe here, wrapped in the soft blanket of history, listening to a story that happened so long ago that it has become almost a kind of myth. The people we are about to meet, the warriors and farmers, the kings and monks, the mothers and children who lived and loved and struggled through these centuries, they are all dust now. Their bones long returned to the earth, but their story remains, carried forward through the generations. And tonight, it is yours to hear. So settle in, let your eyes grow heavy, and prepare to journey deeper into the past. We are going to follow those ships across the North Sea, to meet the people who sailed in them, and to understand why they left their homes for an uncertain future on a foreign shore. We are going to watch them build a new world from the ruins of the old, and we are going to walk beside them through centuries of struggle and triumph, of war and peace, of darkness and light. This is the story of the Anglo-Saxons, and it begins, as so many stories do, with people searching for a better life. It begins with hope and desperation intertwined with courage born of necessity, with small choices that ripple outward into consequences no one could have foreseen. The ships are on the horizon now, their sails catching the wind. The future is coming, whether the people on the shore are ready for it or not, and we will be there to witness it all together. As the night deepens and the story unfolds, rest now and let the journey begin. The arrival Angles, Saxons, and Jutes cross the sea. Let us leave the shore for a moment and travel across the water, back to the lands where those ships began their journey. Picture the coastal regions of what is now northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, a world of marshes and river deltas, of flat gray skies and endless rain. This is the homeland of the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, and it is a hard place to live. The sea is always hungry here. It swallows farmland and villages, creeping inland year by year, turning solid ground into salt marsh and tidal flat. The winters are long and bitter, the summers short and often wet. The soil is poor in many places, exhausted by generations of farming, and there are simply too many people for the land to support. Families that once had enough to eat find themselves struggling, and young men with no inheritance look out at the gray horizon and wonder what lies beyond. They have heard stories, these young men and women, traders and raiders who have visited the island of Britain, bring back tales of green hills and fertile valleys, of a land where the Romans once built great cities but have now departed, leaving behind wealth and opportunity for those bold enough to seize it. The stories speak of British kings who are weak and divided, who desperately need warriors to defend their lands against enemies from the north and west. It sounds almost too good to be true, this distant island. But what choice is there when the sea is rising and the children are hungry? And so they begin to build their boats. These are not the sleek longships that the Vikings will later make famous, but they are sturdy and seaworthy, broad-beamed vessels with shallow drafts that can navigate both open ocean and river mouths. They are clinker-built, their planks overlapping like the scales of a fish, held together with iron rivets and sealed with animal hair mixed with tar. Each boat can carry perhaps 30 or 40 people, along with their animals and their tools and whatever possessions they cannot bear to leave behind. Imagine yourself among them now, preparing for the crossing. You have packed everything you own into bundles and baskets, your seeds for planting, your iron cooking pot, the loom that your mother used and her mother before her. You have said goodbye to the graves of your ancestors, knowing that you will never see them again. You have offered sacrifices to Woden, the Allfather, asking for safe passage across the whale road, and to Thunor, the thunder god, asking for favorable winds. The day of departure arrives, and you wade out into the cold water to climb aboard the boat. The vessel rocks beneath your feet as others clamber in around you, finding places to sit among the cargo. Someone begins to sing, a low rhythmic chant that helps the rowers find their stroke. And slowly the boat pulls away from the shore. You watch your homeland shrinking behind you, the familiar coastline fading into mist, and you feel a strange mixture of grief and excitement swelling in your chest. The crossing takes several days if the weather is kind, longer if it is not. The North Sea is a dangerous passage, prone to sudden storms and treacherous currents. At night, you huddle together for warmth, listening to the creak of the timbers and the slap of waves against the hull. During the day, you watch for landmarks, for the first glimpse of the British coast, for any sign that your journey is nearing its end. And then, one morning, you see it. A dark line on the horizon that grows slowly larger, resolving into chalk cliffs and green hills, into beaches and river mouths, and the promise of a new beginning. The boat surges forward on the incoming tide, carrying you toward a future you cannot yet imagine. According to the old stories, the first Anglo-Saxons to arrive in Britain came not as invaders, but as invited guests. The British King Vortigern, desperate for military help against the Picts and Scots, sent messengers across the sea, offering land and payment to any warriors who would fight for him. The leaders who answered his call were two brothers named Hengist and Horsa, and they brought with them a war band of hardened fighters. At first, the arrangement worked well. The Germanic mercenaries proved their worth in battle, driving back Vortigern's enemies and earning their promised rewards. But success brought more warriors from across the sea, drawn by tales of easy plunder and generous hosts. What began as a trickle became a flood, and soon the mercenaries realized that they were stronger than the people who had hired them. The legends say that Hengist grew greedy and treacherous, that he invited Vortigern and his nobles to a great feast, and then had his warriors draw hidden knives and slaughter them. Whether this story is true or merely a later invention, the result was the same. The invited guests became conquerors, and the conquest of Britain began. But we should be careful not to imagine this as a single dramatic invasion, a moment when everything changed at once. History is rarely so neat and clean. The Anglo-Saxon settlement of Britain was a slow, messy, complicated process that unfolded over many generations. Some came as warriors, yes, but others came as farmers and craftspeople, as families seeking a better life. Some fought their way onto the land, but others intermarried with the native Britons, blending cultures and bloodlines until the boundaries between them blurred and shifted. Imagine the confusion and fear of the British. People watching these strangers arrive in ever greater numbers. Some resisted fiercely, and the old Welsh poems still sing of heroes who fought against the Saxon tide. Others fled westward, into the mountains of Wales and Cornwall, and across the sea to Brittany, carrying their language and their culture with them. Still others stayed and adapted, learning to live alongside the newcomers, adopting their customs, and eventually forgetting that their ancestors had ever been anything else. The newcomers themselves were not a single unified people. The Angles came mostly from the region around the base of the Danish peninsula, and they would eventually settle in the north and east of Britain, giving their name to East Anglia and to England itself. The Saxons came from the coastal regions of what is now northwestern Germany, and they would settle in the south, founding kingdoms called Essex and Sussex and Wessex, the lands of the East Saxons, the South Saxons, and the West Saxons. The Jutes, whose homeland was in present-day Denmark, settled primarily in Kent and on the Isle of Wight. Each group brought its own traditions and its own dialect, its own ways of building houses and burying the dead, but they also shared much in common: a similar language, similar gods, similar values, and social structures. Over time, these similarities would prove stronger than the differences, and the various Germanic settlers would come to think of themselves as one people, as the Anglo-Saxon, the English nation, but that unity lay far in the future. For now, in these early decades of settlement, there is only the hard work of building a new life in a foreign land. Imagine yourself clearing a patch of forest, felling trees with iron axes and burning the stumps to make room for planting. Imagine raising the timber frame of a hall, thatching the roof with reeds, smearing the walls with mud and dung to keep out the wind. Imagine learning which local plants are good to eat and which are poisonous, which streams have the cleanest water, which hills offer the best defense against enemies. It is exhausting work, but there is satisfaction in it too. Each season that passes, each harvest that comes in, each child that is born and survives, is a small victory against the uncertainty of the world. You are putting down roots in this new soil, both literally and figuratively. Your children will grow up speaking of this land as home, and their children will never know any other. The shore where you first landed, becoming the stuff of stories told around the fire on winter nights. Across the sea, in the old homeland, the waters continue to rise and the people continue to leave. Ships are still crossing, bringing new settlers to join the communities that are springing up along the British coast and spreading slowly inland. The transformation of Britain has begun, and it will not stop until the entire eastern half of the island speaks a Germanic tongue and worships Germanic gods. Rest here for a moment in this time of beginnings. The work is hard and the future is uncertain, but there is hope, too, and determination, and the simple human desire to build something that will last. The Anglo-Saxon world is taking shape around you, one settlement at a time, one family at a time, one generation at a time, and the story is only just beginning. The long settlement, building a new world, the years pass as years do, each one bleeding into the next in an endless cycle of planting and harvest, birth and death. The Anglo-Saxon settlements that began as rough clearings in the forest have grown into established villages, and the villages are slowly spreading across the land. It is a gradual process, so slow that no single generation can see the full scope of it, but the shape of a new world is emerging from the chaos of the old. Imagine yourself now as a descendant of those first settlers, born perhaps 100 years after the initial crossing. You have never seen the old homeland across the sea. Britain is the only world you have ever known, and the stories of the migration have already taken on a legendary quality. Tales of brave ancestors who crossed the whale road in search of a better life. You live in a timber hall in a village that bears an Anglo-Saxon name, surrounded by fields that your grandparents cleared and your parents improved, and that you will one day pass on to your own children. The village is the center of your existence. Perhaps 50 or 60 people live here, 3 or 4 extended families bound together by ties of kinship and mutual obligation. You know everyone by name, know their strengths and weaknesses, their histories and their hopes. Together you work the fields that surround the village, following a rhythm of agriculture that has sustained your people for generations. In spring, you plow the heavy clay soil with teams of oxen, turning over the earth in long, straight furrows. In summer, you weed and tend the growing crops, praying to the old gods for enough rain but not too much. In autumn, you harvest the grain and slaughter the animals that cannot be fed through the winter. smoking and salting the meat to preserve it. In winter, you huddle around the fire in the great hall, mending tools and weaving cloth and listening to the stories that connect you to your past. The hall is the heart of the village, the largest building by far. It is a long, rectangular structure, its timber frame rising to a peaked roof covered with thatch. Inside, a central hearth burns day and night, filling the space with warmth and smoke that drifts up to escape through gaps in the roof. Along the walls are benches where people sit during the day and sleep at night. The lord of the village, your chieftain, sits at the head of the hall on a raised platform, dispensing justice and hospitality and protection to all who owe him loyalty. This system of loyalty and obligation is the glue that holds Anglo-Saxon society together. You owe service to your lord labor in his fields, military support in times of war, a share of your harvest to fill his storehouses. In return, he owes you protection against enemies, justice when you are wronged, and generosity in the form of feasts and gifts. When the great hall is full and the mead is flowing and the poet is singing tales of heroes and monsters, you feel the bonds of community wrapping around you like a warm cloak, connecting you to everyone present and to all the generations that came before. But the world beyond the village is complex and often dangerous. The various Anglo-Saxon settlements have coalesced into kingdoms, each one ruled by a king who claims authority over a patchwork of villages and chieftains. These kingdoms are constantly shifting, their borders expanding and contracting as kings rise and fall, as wars are won and lost, as alliances are made and broken. In the north is Northumbria, stretching from the Humber to the borders of the Pictish lands. In the center is Mercia, a powerful kingdom growing in strength and ambition. In the east is East Anglia, wealthy from trade across the North Sea. In the south are the kingdoms of the Saxons Essex, Sussex, Wessex, and in the southeast is Kent, the oldest of all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, where Hengist and Horsa first made their landfall. The boundaries between these kingdoms are fluid, and the boundaries between Anglo-Saxon and British are fluid as well. In the west, beyond the limits of Anglo-Saxon settlement, the old British kingdoms endure. Wales and Cornwall and Cumbria are still Celtic lands, their people speaking languages descended from the ancient tongue of pre-Roman Britain, their kings tracing their lineages back to heroes who fought against the Saxon invaders. The relationship between these worlds is complicated, sometimes hostile, sometimes peaceful, always wary. Cattle are raided across the borders. Battles are fought over disputed territories. But trade and intermarriage also cross the boundaries, blending the two cultures in ways that neither side fully acknowledges. Even within the Anglo-Saxon lands, the old British population has not simply disappeared. Some fled to the west, yes, but many more remain, absorbed into the new order. In some regions, entire British communities were allowed to continue as they were, paying tribute to Anglo-Saxon lords, but maintaining their own language and customs. In other places, British people worked as servants and laborers for Anglo-Saxon masters, their descendants eventually forgetting their origins as they adopted the language and identity of the conquerors. The genetic and cultural mixing was extensive, far more than the heroic stories of conquest would suggest. The Anglo-Saxon language itself reflects this blending. While its core is Germanic, it has absorbed words from the British tongue and from the Latin that the Romans left behind. Place names across England preserve this layered history. Rivers and hills often bear Celtic names, while the settlements on their banks have Anglo-Saxon ones. London, the great city on the Thames, has a Celtic name, while Westminster, just upstream, is purely Anglo-Saxon. The land remembers all its inhabitants, even when the inhabitants themselves forget. If you find yourself growing drowsy as you listen to this story, that is perfectly all right. Let your mind drift along with the generations passing, each one building on the work of those who came before. Imagine the slow transformation of the landscape as more and more forest is cleared, as villages grow into towns, as paths become roads and roads become highways. Imagine the gradual accumulation of knowledge and custom, the development of laws and traditions, the emergence of a distinct Anglo-Saxon identity from the mixture of peoples and cultures that have come together on this island. The religion of your ancestors still holds sway in these centuries. Before the coming of Christianity, you worship Woden, the All-Father, God of wisdom and war and death. You honor Thunder, the thunder god, whose hammer protects mankind from the forces of chaos. You make offerings to Frigg, the goddess of love and fertility, and to Teve, the god of justice and combat. The days of the week bear their names, even now: Wednesday for Woden, Thursday for Thunder, Friday for Frigg, Tuesday for Ti. When you swear an oath, you swear by these gods, and you believe that they watch over you, guiding your fate according to a pattern that is woven into the very fabric of existence. This concept of fate, of word, is central to the Anglo-Saxon understanding of the world. Everything that happens is part of a vast tapestry, woven by forces beyond human comprehension. Your life, your death, your successes and failures, all are threads in this tapestry, and no amount of struggle can change what has already been woven. This belief gives your ancestors a kind of stoic courage. Fear. Fate is already determined. There is no point in fearing death, only in meeting it bravely when it comes. The heroes of the old stories face their ends with grim determination, knowing that their deeds will live on in memory, even after their bodies have returned to the earth. The centuries of settlement are drawing toward a turning point now, though the people living through them cannot yet see it. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms are growing in power and sophistication, developing more complex systems of government and law. Trade networks are expanding, connecting Britain to the wider world of Europe. And from across the sea, from the warm lands around the Mediterranean, a new religion is spreading northward, carried by missionaries who bring with them not only a new God, but a new way of understanding the world. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxons is coming, and it will transform their society in ways both subtle and profound. But that is a story for the next part of our journey. For now, rest in this world of timber halls and sacred groves, of warrior kings and ancient gods, of farmers and craftspeople building lives of quiet dignity in a land that is slowly becoming their own. The fire in the great hall is burning low, and the night is deep and quiet. Let the rhythm of this ancient life lull you towards sleep, knowing that the story will continue when you are ready to hear it. The conversion from old gods to Christ as you settle deeper into relaxation. Let us move forward through the centuries to a time when everything the Anglo-Saxons believed about the world was about to change. The year is 597, and a group of about 40 men are making their way through the kingdom of Kent. They are monks, sent from Rome by Pope Gregory the Great, and they are led by a man named Augustine. They have traveled for months to reach this distant island, and they carry with them a message that will reshape Anglo-Saxon civilization. Imagine the scene as these foreign monks approach the court of King Ethelbert of Kent. King is one of the most powerful rulers in Britain, his influence extending far beyond his own small kingdom. He has agreed to meet with these strangers, but he is wary of their magic. He insists that the meeting take place outdoors, under the open sky, where no spells or enchantments can be worked upon him within the confines of walls and roof. The monks process toward him carrying a silver cross and an icon of Christ, singing hymns in a language the king does not understand. What happens next is the beginning of something extraordinary. Augustine speaks to the king through interpreters, telling him about the Christian God, about Jesus Christ, about the promise of eternal life for those who believe. Ethelbert listens thoughtfully. He is not immediately convinced, but he is intrigued, and his wife Bertha is already a Christian, a Frankish princess who brought her faith with her when she came across the sea to marry him. The king gives the monks permission to stay and preach, offering them a place to live in his capital of Canterbury. The conversion of Kent does not happen overnight. Ethelbert waits and watches, observing the monks and their way of life, considering the implications of accepting their faith. When he finally agrees to be baptized, it is a carefully calculated decision, balancing spiritual conviction against political advantage. Christianity connects him to the powerful kingdoms of continental Europe, to the legacy of the Roman Empire, to a network of learning and diplomacy that stretches across the known world. But there is something more as well, something harder to quantify: a genuine response to the message of hope and redemption that the monks proclaim. What did this conversion mean for ordinary people? Let yourself imagine being a farmer or a craftsperson in one of the villages of Kent during these years of transition. For your entire life, you have worshipped the old gods. You have left offerings at sacred springs and ancient trees. You have celebrated the turning of the seasons with festivals and rituals passed down from your ancestors. The world has been full of spirits and powers, of fate and word, of a cosmic order that you understood and accepted. Now the king has embraced a new God, and his priests are traveling through the land, preaching in the market squares and village greens. They tell you that the old gods are false, that there is only one true God who created everything that exists. They tell you about Jesus, who died to save you from your sins, and about the promise of heaven for those who believe. They build churches on the sites of your old sacred places, transforming the landscape of the holy, even as they try to transform the landscape of your heart. The transition is neither quick nor easy. Many people simply layer the new beliefs on top of the old, hedging their bets by honoring both Christ and Woden, attending church on Sunday but still leaving offerings for the land spirits. The missionaries are sometimes flexible about this, understanding that complete transformation takes time. They adapt Christian festivals to align with existing Anglo-Saxon celebrations. Seltzer takes its English name from Easter, a goddess of spring, And Christmas absorbs many of the traditions of the midwinter festival of Yule. Gradually, over decades and generations, Christianity sinks deeper roots into Anglo-Saxon society. Churches and monasteries spread across the land, becoming centers not only of worship but of learning and charity. The monks and nuns who live in these communities are among the few people who can read and write, and they use these skills to preserve knowledge that might otherwise be lost. They copy out books by hand, painstakingly transferring ancient wisdom onto fresh parchment. They write histories and poems, saints' lives and law codes. They become advisors to kings and teachers of children. One of the greatest of these monastic scholars is a man known as the Venerable Bede, who lives in the monastery of Jarrow in Northumbria in the early 8th century. Bede writes the first history of the English people, gathering together all the stories and documents he can find to create a comprehensive account of Anglo-Saxon history from the earliest times to his own day. His work is a treasure beyond measure, the source of much of what we know about this period. Without Bede, figures like Hengist and Horsa and Augustine would be little more than names to us, shadows flickering in the darkness of the past. The monasteries also become repositories of beauty. Monks and nuns create illuminated manuscripts, adorning the sacred texts with intricate patterns and vivid colors that blend Christian imagery with the abstract designs of traditional Anglo-Saxon art. The Lindisfarne Gospels, created around the year 700, are among the most beautiful books ever made. Their pages covered with interlocking spirals and fantastical creatures that seem to dance and shimmer in the candlelight. Objects of precious metal are crafted for use in worship chalices and crosses. Book covers and reliquaries, one a testament to the devotion and skill of its maker. But Christianity is not only about monks and manuscripts. It changes the texture of everyday life in countless ways. Marriage becomes a sacrament, regulated by the church rather than simply by family agreement. The dead are buried in consecrated ground, their graves marked with crosses instead of the grave goods that once accompanied the pagan dead into the afterlife. The weekly rhythm of life now revolves around Sunday, the Lord's Day, when work ceases and people gather for worship. Saints' days and holy seasons punctuate the year, giving shape and meaning to the passage of time. The position of women in society is subtly transformed as well. Christianity teaches that women have souls equal to men in the eyes of God. And while this does not translate into anything like modern equality, it does open new possibilities. Women can become nuns, living lives of learning and leadership within the walls of their convents. Some of these religious women become powerful figures in their own right. Hildabbess of Whitby in the 7th century presides over a double monastery of both monks and nuns, hosts an important church council, and nurtures the talents of said the first English poet whose name we know. Perhaps what Christianity offers most of all is a new story to make sense of the world. Instead of the grim fatalism of word, where everything is predetermined and even the gods will eventually fall to chaos, Christianity offers hope. It tells of a God who loves humanity, who became human himself to share in human suffering, who conquered death and promises eternal life to all who follow him. The darkness is still there, the world is still fallen, still full of sin and sorrow, but beyond the darkness is a light that can never be extinguished. Imagine yourself lying in your bed in an Anglo-Saxon village, somewhere in the 7th or 8th century. The old gods are fading from memory, their names preserved now only in the days of the week and in the stories that grandparents tell. The church at the center of the village is built of timber, humble and small, but it represents a connection to something vast and ancient, a community of faith that stretches back to Christ himself and will stretch forward to the end of time. When you are troubled or afraid, you can pray to a God who, you have been taught, hears and cares. When you die, you will be buried in the churchyard, and your soul will go to judgment. And if you have lived well, you will find rest at last in heaven. The transition from paganism to Christianity is one of the great transformations of human history, and it happens differently in every place and time. In Anglo-Saxon England, it happens gradually and incompletely, with old beliefs lingering in folk customs and superstitions, with the boundary between sacred and secular always blurring and shifting. But by the 8th century, England is firmly part of the Christian world, its kings ruling by the grace of God, its scholars contributing to the intellectual life of Europe, its churches and monasteries dotting the landscape like points of light in the darkness. It is into this Christian England that a new threat will soon emerge. The monasteries that have become centers of learning and art have also become repositories of treasure, gold and silver, and precious gems that glitter in the light of altar candles. They sit mostly undefended, accessible to anyone with a boat and the will to take what they contain across the North Sea. In the lands of Scandinavia, a new age of expansion is beginning. The Northmen are building their ships and sharpening their swords, and they are looking south and west toward the wealthy, peaceful kingdoms of Christian Europe. The Viking Age is about to begin. The Viking Age raiders, settlers, and the great heathen army. The year is 793, and it is a summer day on the holy island of Lindisfarne, off the northeast coast of England. The monks who live here have risen before dawn, as they do every day, to sing the first prayers of the morning. The monastery is one of the most sacred sites in all of Britain, founded over 100 years ago by Saint Heathen, home to the magnificent Gospels that bear its name. The community is wealthy and learned, secure in its faith and in the peace that Christianity has brought to the land. And then the ships appear. Imagine the terror of that morning. The dragon-headed prows emerging from the sea mist, the warriors leaping into the shallow water, the screaming and the clash of weapons. The monks have no defenses, no soldiers to protect them. They are men of peace in a world that has suddenly become very violent. Some try to flee, some try to hide, some stand their ground and are cut down where they stand. The Vikings move through the monastery with brutal efficiency, stripping the altars of their treasures, tearing the precious metal covers from the sacred books, taking everything of value they can carry. When it is over, the church is a smoking ruin, and the beach is littered with the bodies of the dead. Some of the monks have been taken as slaves, destined to be sold in the markets of Dublin or Scandinavia. The treasures of Lindisfarne are loaded onto the ships, and the raiders sail away as quickly as they came, vanishing into the gray expanse of the North Sea. The news spreads across Europe like wildfire. The scholar Alcuin, an Englishman serving at the court of Charlemagne, writes letters of anguished disbelief. Never before, he says, has such terror appeared in Britain. The church of St. Cuthbert, splattered with the blood of the priests of God, stripped of all its treasures, is as if the end of the world has come. Other attacks follow in quick succession. Jarrow is raided the following year, and monasteries along the Scottish and Irish coasts fall victim in the years after. That what the Anglo-Saxons could not know was that they were witnessing the beginning of a storm that would last for nearly 3 centuries. The Viking Age had begun, and it would transform the world they knew. But let us take a moment to understand who these raiders were and where they came from. The word Viking is not a name for a people, but a description of an activity. To go Viking is to go raiding, to sail across the sea in search of plunder and adventure. The people we call Vikings were Scandinavians, from the lands that are now Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Like the Anglo-Saxons before them, they were Germanic peoples, speaking related languages, worshipping similar gods. In many ways, the Vikings of the 8th century were not so different from the Anglo-Saxons of the 5th. Warriors and farmers and traders, pushed outward from their homelands by pressure of population and lured by tales of wealth and opportunity across the sea. The early Viking raids on England were hit-and-run affairs, quick strikes on coastal targets, followed by rapid retreats. The raiders had no interest in conquest or settlement, only in plunder. They came in the summer sailing season, took what they could, and returned home before winter. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, focused on their own internal rivalries, were slow to develop effective defenses. Year after year, the raids continued, growing bolder and more ambitious as the Vikings learned that resistance was weak and the rewards were rich. Imagine yourself as an ordinary person living through these decades of terror. You are a farmer, perhaps, or a craftsperson in a village somewhere along the eastern coast of England. Every summer, you watch the horizon with dread, knowing that at any moment the dragon ships might appear. You have heard the stories of what happens when they come: the killing and the burning, the women and children taken as slaves, the livestock driven off, the crops destroyed. You pray to God for protection, but you also hide your valuables and keep your tools sharp, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. But then something changes. In the year 865, a force unlike any that has come before lands on the shores of East Anglia. The Anglo-Saxon chroniclers call it the Great Heathen Army, and it has not come to raid and retreat. It has come to conquer. The leaders of this army are legendary figures: Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, Uberman, whose names would be remembered in saga and chronicle for centuries to come. They are said to be the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, a famous Viking hero whose death at the hands of an English king they have come to avenge. Whatever their motivations, their methods are devastatingly effective. Over the next decade, they systematically dismantle the great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that have dominated England for centuries. Northumbria falls first. The Vikings capture York, the ancient capital, and establish it as the center of their power in the north. East Anglia is next, its King Edmund martyred for his faith, his memory preserved in the name of Bury St. Edmunds, then Mercia. The great kingdom of the Midlands collapses under the Viking assault, its eastern regions absorbed into what will become known as the Danelaw, the lands where Danish law and Danish custom prevail, one by one. The candles of Anglo-Saxon civilization flicker and go out. The monasteries that have been centers of learning for generations are abandoned or destroyed. The books and treasures that took lifetimes to create are scattered or lost. The great halls of the Anglo-Saxon kings fall silent, their timbers collapsing into the earth. It seems, in these dark years, as if everything the Anglo-Saxons have built is about to be swept away forever. And yet, one kingdom survives. In the southwest of England, protected somewhat by distance and geography, the kingdom of Wessex holds firm. Its king Tellard and his younger brother Alfred fight battle after battle against the Viking forces, sometimes winning, sometimes losing, always refusing to surrender. When Tellard dies in 871, Alfred becomes king, and the fate of England comes to rest on his shoulders. But even Alfred cannot hold back the tide forever. In the winter of 8, the Vikings launch a surprise attack, shattering the West Saxon forces and driving Alfred into hiding. The king of the last free English kingdom becomes a fugitive, fleeing through the marshes of Somerset with only a handful of followers. Everything seems lost. Picture Alfred in those darkest days, hiding in the wetlands of Athelney. The land around him is a maze of waterways and islands, of reed beds and willow groves, accessible only to those who know the secret paths. The king who once commanded armies now shelters in a peasant's hut, reduced to begging for food and shelter. The famous story has him scolded by a farmer's wife for letting her cakes burn, while he sits lost in thought, a king so diminished that he cannot even be trusted to mind the baking. But Alfred is not a man to give in to despair. Even in his darkest hour, he is planning his return. He sends out messages to the loyal men of Wessex, calling them to gather at a place called Egbert's Stone when the time is right. He makes alliances with local leaders in the marshlands, building a network of resistance. And he waits for the moment when the Vikings let down their guard. That moment comes in the spring. Alfred emerges from the marshes at the head of a hastily gathered army, and the men of Somerset and Wiltshire and Hampshire flock to his banner. The Vikings, led by the warlord Guthrum, march to meet him. The two armies clash at a place called Eddington, somewhere on the chalk downs of Wiltshire, and after a long and bloody battle, the Vikings break and flee. It is a turning point, perhaps the turning point in the entire history of England. If Alfred had lost at Eddington, if Wessex had fallen, as all the other kingdoms had fallen, there would be no England as we know it. The entire island might have become a Scandinavian territory, its language and culture utterly transformed. But Alfred won, and in winning, he preserved the future. The war is not over. It will continue for generations, but the tide has turned. Alfred negotiates a treaty with Guthrum, establishing a boundary between Wessex and the Danelaw. The Viking leader agrees to be baptized as a Christian, with Alfred standing as his godfather. It is a moment of reconciliation as well as victory, a recognition that the Vikings are not going away, and that some form of coexistence must be found. Let yourself rest in this moment of hope after so much darkness. The kingdom of Wessex has survived against all odds, and its young king has shown himself to be a leader of exceptional courage and wisdom. The story of the Anglo-Saxons is not over far from it. In fact, the most remarkable chapters are still to come. But for now, let the tension ease from your body. The battle is won. The immediate danger has passed. There will be more struggles ahead, more challenges to face. But tonight, At least there is peace. Alfred and the fight for survival after the victory at Edington. Alfred returned to his kingdom not merely as a survivor, but as a visionary. He understood, perhaps better than any ruler of his age, that winning a single battle was not enough. The Vikings would return, they always return, and Wessex could not survive through luck and courage alone. It needed systems and structures, defenses that would endure whether or not a brilliant king sat on the throne. And so Alfred set about transforming his kingdom in ways that would shape England for centuries to come. Imagine the years following Edington, the kingdom slowly healing from the wounds of war. Fields that had been abandoned are brought back under cultivation. Villages that had been destroyed are rebuilt. But Alfred is not content simply to restore what was lost. He is building something new, something stronger, something that can withstand the storms that he knows will come again. His first great project is military. Alfred creates a network of fortified towns called burhs, strategically positioned across his kingdom so that no place is more than a day's march from refuge. These are not simply forts, but functioning communities with permanent garrisons drawn from the surrounding countryside. When the Vikings raid, the people of the region can fall back to the nearest burh, bringing their livestock and their valuables with them. The attackers find not easy victims, but defended walls and determined defenders. The system is meticulously planned. A document called the Burgel Heidage, compiled during Alfred's reign, lists each burh along with the number of men required to defend its walls. 1 man for every pole of wall, 4 men for every pole of gateway. The mathematics of defense have been calculated down to the last detail, and the system works. When the Vikings return, and they do return, again and again throughout Alfred's reign, they find a kingdom that is no longer easy prey. But Alfred's vision extends far beyond walls and soldiers. He understands that a kingdom is more than its defenses, that a people need more than safety to truly flourish. They need law and learning, culture and faith. And so, alongside his military reforms, Alfred undertakes an equally ambitious program of education and renewal. The king himself learns to read Latin in his late 30s, an extraordinary achievement for a man who has spent his life at war. Once he has mastered the language, he begins translating important works into English, not the Latin of scholars and churchmen, but the everyday language of his people. He translates Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care, a guide for bishops and priests. He translates Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, a meditation on fate and fortune that speaks directly to Alfred's own experience of suffering and perseverance. He translates portions of the Psalms, bringing the words of Scripture into the mouths of ordinary people. This is revolutionary. Before Alfred, important books were written in Latin, accessible only to those with years of education. By translating into English, Alfred opens the world of learning to a much wider audience. He sends copies of his translations to every bishop in his kingdom, along with expensive reading pointers made of precious metal, urging them to share the wisdom with their flocks. The English language itself is elevated by this royal attention, becoming not just a tongue for farmers and warriors, but a language worthy of philosophy and prayer. If you are still awake, listening to this story, take a moment to appreciate the quiet heroism of what Alfred accomplished. This was a man who had every excuse to focus solely on survival, to spend his reign simply fighting off one Viking attack after another. Instead, he found time between battles to learn a new language, to translate books, to plan schools and libraries, to think about what kind of society he wanted to leave behind. The Vikings destroyed many things, but they could not destroy Alfred's belief that knowledge was worth preserving and sharing. The king also reforms the legal system of his kingdom, compiling a new law code that draws on earlier Anglo-Saxon laws as well as biblical principles. The laws of Alfred emphasize fairness and due process, protecting the rights of free men while acknowledging the obligations of different social ranks. They are not perfect by modern standards. Slavery is still legal. Social hierarchy is taken for granted, but they represent a genuine attempt to create a just and orderly society. Alfred's Christian faith suffuses everything he does. He sees himself as a shepherd, responsible for the souls as well as the bodies of his people. He founds monasteries and encourages the revival of monastic learning that had been devastated by the Viking raids. He invites scholars from other lands, from the Frankish kingdoms, from as far away as Rome, to come and teach in his realm. The court of Wessex becomes a center of intellectual life, a beacon of civilization in a world that often seems consumed by darkness. But the Vikings have not gone away. Throughout Alfred's reign, they test the defenses of Wessex, probing for weakness, raiding where they can. In the 890s, a massive new army crosses from the continent, fresh from devastating the Frankish kingdoms, hungry for conquest. For 4 years, Alfred fights this new threat, leading his armies from one end of his kingdom to the other, besieging Viking camps and chasing Viking ships. He is in his 40s now, an old man by the standards of the age, worn down by decades of war and illness. But he does not stop. The final great campaign ends not with a climactic battle, but with a gradual wearing down of the enemy. The Viking army, unable to break through Alfred's defenses, eventually gives up and disperses. Some settle in the Danelaw, some return to the continent, some sail off to seek easier prey elsewhere. Alfred has won not through a single decisive victory, but through stubborn, patient endurance. On October 26, 899, Alfred dies. He is about 50 years old, and he has ruled Wessex for nearly 30 of those years. He has taken a kingdom on the brink of destruction and transformed it into the strongest power in Britain. He has laid the foundations for a unified England that his children and grandchildren will build. He has preserved learning and culture through one of the darkest periods in European history. Later generations will call him Alfred the Great, and of all the kings of England, he alone bears that title. But perhaps Alfred's greatest legacy is less tangible than his burrs, and his laws and his translations. It is the idea he embodied the belief that a king should be more than a warlord, that power carries responsibility, that civilization is worth fighting for, even when the fight seems hopeless. In his own writings, Alfred often reflects on the nature of wisdom and virtue, on the duties of rulers and the meaning of a good life. These are not abstract questions for him, but urgent, practical concerns, worked out in the crucible of lived experience. Let yourself imagine Alfred in his final years, sitting in his hall in Winchester, the candles burning low, the night quiet after the long decades of war. He knows that his work is unfinished. The Danala still stretches across the north and east of England. The Vikings still rule in York and East Anglia. But he has done what he could. He has given his people a chance, and he trusts in God and in the abilities of his successors to finish what he started. His son Edward is a capable warrior, proven in battle against the Danes. His daughter Telford has married the Lord of Mercia and shows every sign of inheriting her father's intelligence and determination. The generation that Alfred raised will be the generation that reconquers the Danelaw and unites England for the first time. The story is not over. It is in fact entering its most triumphant phase. But that is for another section of our tale. For now, let us honor the memory of Alfred, the king who refused to give up when all seemed lost, who fought not just for his own survival, but for the survival of everything he believed in. In the great tapestry of English history, there are few threads more golden than his. Rest now, as Alfred rests, knowing that the struggle continues, but that hope endures. The long night of the Viking invasions is beginning to give way to dawn, and the kingdom that Alfred built will prove stronger than its enemies ever imagined. Close your eyes and let his story settle into your memory, a gift from the distant past to the quiet of your present night. The unification of England when Alfred died in 899. He left behind a kingdom that had been transformed, but the work of unification was far from complete. The Danelaw still covered more than half of what we now call England, and the Viking kings in York showed no signs of submitting to West Saxon rule. It would take another 50 years and 3 remarkable rulers to finish what Alfred had begun. And so, as you settle deeper into comfort, let us follow the story forward to its triumphant conclusion. Alfred's son, Edward, who would later be called Edward the Elder, inherited both his father's throne and his father's determination. But Edward did not work alone. His sister, Telfald, who had married the alderman of Mercia, proved to be one of the most capable rulers of the age. When her husband became ill and eventually died, Telfald took power in her own right, governing Mercia and commanding its armies. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles call her the Lady of the Mercians, and she earned that title through decades of military and political leadership. Imagine the partnership between these two siblings, brother and sister, working in concert to reclaim the lands their father had been unable to reach. Edward advances from the south, building burhs in the Alfred style, systematically securing territory before moving on. Telfald does the same from the Mercian heartland, constructing fortresses at Derby and Tamworth and Leicester. The strategy is patient and methodical. No dramatic cavalry charges, no desperate gambles. Just steady pressure that slowly squeezes the Danelaw from 2 directions at once. The Danes, who had settled in England, were not simply invaders camping in hostile territory. By now, 2 generations had passed since the great heathen army first landed. The Danish warriors had become Danish farmers, Danish craftsmen, Danish families with roots in the soil. Many had converted to Christianity. Many had intermarried with their Anglo-Saxon neighbors. The boundary between Dane and Saxon was becoming increasingly blurred, a matter more of political allegiance than of blood or culture. This made the reconquest less a war of extermination than a war of reintegration. When Edward and Telfald captured a Danish town, they did not drive out its inhabitants, but accepted their submission and incorporated them into the expanding kingdom. The Danes kept their land, kept their customs, kept their local leaders. They simply acknowledged a new overlord. The process was sometimes violent and sometimes peaceful, but it was remarkably effective. Telfeld died in 918, just as the reconquest was reaching its final stages. She had lived to see most of the Danish territories of the Midlands brought under her authority, but she did not live to see the completion of the work. That honor would fall to her brother Edward, who absorbed Mercia into Wessex after her death, and then to Edward's son, who would become the first true king of England. His name was Alfred, and he came to the throne in 924, raised in the court of his aunt Thelfeld, educated in the Mercian as well as the West Saxon tradition. Athelstan was ideally positioned to rule a united kingdom. He was a scholar and a collector as well as a warrior, gathering books and relics from across Europe, forging alliances through marriage and diplomacy, presenting himself as a king worthy to stand alongside the great rulers of the continent. Aethelstan did what no Anglo-Saxon king had ever done before. He conquered the Viking kingdom of York, driving out its Scandinavian rulers and bringing Northumbria under his direct control. For the first time, a single ruler governed all of the English peoples, from the Channel to the Scottish border. Athelstan could legitimately call himself Rex Anglorum, king of the English, and coins minted during his reign bear this proud title. But conquest and coronation are one thing. Holding a united kingdom together is another. The old divisions did not disappear overnight. Northumbria remained restive, always looking north. The Welsh princes and the Scottish kings watched nervously, worried that this powerful new English kingdom might turn its ambitions toward their own lands. These fears boiled over into war. The Battle of Brunanburh is one of the most celebrated events in Anglo-Saxon history, commemorated in a poem that was inserted into the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. A grand coalition of enemies, the Scottish king Constantine, the Viking king Olaf of Dublin, the Welsh kings and the lords of Strathclyde gathered their forces and invaded England, determined to destroy this new unified kingdom before it could grow too strong. Athelstan met them somewhere in the north, at a place whose exact location has been lost to history, and the armies clashed in a battle that lasted from dawn to dusk. The poem that celebrates the victory is not gentle bedtime listening, full as it is of blood and slaughter, but the outcome is what matters for our story. Aethelstan won a crushing victory, breaking the coalition and securing his kingdom against its enemies. The poem boasts that never before had so great a slaughter been seen on this island. And while this may be poetic exaggeration, the scale of the battle was clearly immense. After Brunanburh, no serious challenge to English unity would emerge for another generation. Let yourself drift now, imagining England in the years following Brunanburh. The kingdom is at peace, or something close to it. The burghs that Alfred built have grown into thriving towns, centers of trade and craft production. The church has recovered from the devastations of the Viking Age, and new monasteries are being founded across the land. The English language is flourishing, its poetry and prose reaching new heights of sophistication. This is the world of the later Anglo-Saxon period, sometimes called the Benedictine Renaissance, for the revival of monastic culture that characterizes it. Kings like Edgar, who ruled from 959 to 975, preside over a stable and prosperous kingdom. Edgar's coronation at Bath in 973, when he was rowed across the river by a crew of subservient kings, symbolizes the power and prestige that England has achieved. The little kingdom that Alfred saved from the Vikings has become one of the major powers of Northern Europe. But the peace of Edgar's reign does not last. After his death, his sons quarrel over the succession, and one of them, Edward, is murdered by supporters of his half-brother. The new king, Telerdead, comes to the throne as a child under a cloud of suspicion and violence. His reign will be troubled from the start, and the troubles will only grow worse. For, across the sea, a new generation of Vikings is stirring. The Scandinavian kingdoms have grown stronger and more organized during the 10th century, and their kings are beginning to look outward once again. The raids that had plagued Alfred's generation are about to return, and this time they will be backed by the full resources of organized states. But that is a story for the next part of our journey. For now, let us rest in this moment of achievement, this high point of Anglo-Saxon civilization. England exists as a unified kingdom, its people sharing a common language and a common identity. The dream that began with Alfred in the marshes of Athelney has been realized by his descendants. Whatever challenges lie ahead, this accomplishment can never be taken away. The night is quiet, the story is long, and there is still more to tell. But the greatest victories have been won, and the kingdom that will face the trials to come is stronger than it has ever been. Breathe deeply and let your mind rest. The unification of England is complete, and for this moment, at least, all is well. The Second Viking Age and the end approaches. The peace that followed the unification of England was fragile, and it did not endure. As you drift deeper into the night, let us follow the story into its darker chapters. When new threats emerged from across the sea and the Anglo-Saxon kingdom faced trials that would have tested even Alfred himself, the reign of Thelard, who came to be known as Thelard the Unready, began in blood and would end in exile. The nickname does not mean what modern ears might assume. It is not a comment on his preparedness, but a bitter pun on his name. Tellard means noble counsel, and Unrid means no counsel or bad counsel. Tellard the ill-advised, we might say. The king who never received good advice or never took it when it was offered. From the beginning, Alfred's reign was plagued by Viking raids. The attacks started small, testing the kingdom's defenses, probing for weakness. When they found that weakness, when English armies failed to coordinate, when local leaders pursued their own interests instead of the common defense, when promised reinforcements never arrive, the raids grew larger and bolder. By the 990s CE, the English were facing invasions on a scale not seen since the days of Alfred. Thelred's response was to pay the Vikings to go away. The Danegeld, as this tribute came to be called, was an enormous tax raised from the English people and handed over to the enemy in exchange for promises of peace. The sums involved were staggering £10,000 of silver in 991, 24,000 in 1002, 36,000 in 1007. Each payment bought only a temporary respite before the raiders returned, hungry for more. Imagine the frustration and despair of the English people during these years. You work hard, you bring in the harvest, you give your taxes to the king, and the king gives your money to the very men who burned your neighbor's farm and carried off his children. The policy was deeply unpopular, and it bred resentment against the king and his advisors. But what was the alternative? The English armies seemed unable to defeat the Viking forces in open battle, and the kingdom lacked the unity and organization that had made Alfred's resistance possible in 1002. Tellard took a different and terrible approach. On St. Brice's Day, November 13th, he ordered the massacre of all Danes living in England. The extent of the killing is unclear. It could not have affected the heavily Danish areas of the Danelaw, but in towns across the south of England, Danish men, women, and children were hunted down and slaughtered. Among the dead, according to later accounts, was Gunhild, sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, king of Denmark. If Tellard hoped that the massacre would intimidate his enemies, he was gravely mistaken. Sweyn launched a furious campaign of revenge that would not end until England itself was conquered. Year after year, Danish armies ravaged the English countryside. The defenses that Alfred had built were overwhelmed or abandoned. The careful network of burhs that had protected Wessex for generations proved inadequate against an enemy that came with overwhelming force and implacable determination. Sweyn Forkbeard arrived in England not as a raider but as a conqueror, and the English resistance collapsed. The Tellard fled across the Channel to Normandy, where his wife Emma had family connections. Sweyn was acknowledged as King of England, the first Danish ruler of the English throne. But his triumph was brief. Just 5 weeks after completing his conquest, Sweyn died suddenly, leaving his newly won kingdom in chaos. The throne passed to Sweyn's son Canute, but Dethlard returned from exile to contest it. The war dragged on for another 2 years, until Tellard died in 1016, and his son Edmund Ironside took up the fight. Edmund was a more capable warrior than his father, and he won several battles against Canute, but he could not turn the tide. After a final confrontation at Ossendon in Essex, Edmund and Canute agreed to divide the kingdom between them. Edmund would rule, Canute would rule everything else. Edmund died within weeks of this agreement, under circumstances that have never been fully explained. Canute became king of all England, and the Anglo-Saxon royal line was swept aside. And yet, remarkably, this was not the disaster that it might seem. Canute proved to be a wise and effective ruler, one of the best kings England has ever had. He married Æthelred's widow Emma, linking himself to the old dynasty. He promoted Englishmen to positions of power and governed according to English law. He was generous to the church and maintained the peace. Under Canute, England became the center of a North Sea empire that included Denmark and Norway, a great power in the European world. Let yourself settle into the strange calm of Canute's reign, this unexpected peace after so much suffering. The Viking king sits on the English throne, but he rules as an English king, adopting the customs and the faith of the people he has conquered. The transition from Anglo-Saxon to Danish rule is remarkably smooth, far smoother than anyone could have expected. Life goes on. Farmers plow their fields, merchants trade their goods, monks pray in their monasteries, and for most ordinary people, the change of dynasty means little in their daily lives. Canute dies in 1035, and his sons prove far less capable than their father. Within 7 years, the Danish line has died out. and the throne passes back to the old Wessex dynasty in the person of Edward, son of Tellard and Emma. Edward has spent most of his life in exile in Normandy, and he brings with him Norman advisors, Norman customs, Norman ways of doing things. The English call him Edward the Confessor for his exceptional piety, and he will be remembered as a saint. But he will also be remembered as a king without an heir, whose death will trigger a succession crisis that changes everything. Edward builds Westminster Abbey, pouring resources into the construction of a magnificent church in the new Norman style. It is his great project, his legacy to his kingdom, and he lives just long enough to see it consecrated. On January 5th, 1066, Edward the Confessor dies, and the question of who will succeed him plunges England into its final crisis. 3 men claim the throne. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful nobleman in England, says that Edward named him heir on his deathbed. William, Duke of Normandy, says that Edward promised him the throne years earlier and that Harold swore an oath to support his claim. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, says that he has inherited the rights of the Danish kings who once ruled England. Each is prepared to fight for what he believes is his, and the fate of England hangs in the balance. The year 1066 is coming, the most famous date in English history. The last chapter of the Anglo-Saxon story is about to unfold, and when it ends, the world will never be the same. But that final chapter deserves its own telling. Rest now in the twilight of Anglo-Saxon England, in these last days before everything changes. The kingdom has survived so much: the end of Rome, the migrations, the conversions, the Viking invasions, the unification, the conquests. It will not survive what is coming, not in its present form. But nothing is ever truly lost. The story continues, in different forms, through different peoples, carrying forward the threads of everything that came before. Close your eyes and let the weight of history settle gently upon you. The end is near, but endings are also beginnings, and the story of England is only just beginning. The fall and the legacy. The year is 1066, and England stands on the brink of transformation. As you rest here in the quiet darkness, let us walk together through the final chapter of the Anglo-Saxon age, through the battles and the blood, to find what remains when the fighting is done. Edward the Confessor died on January 5th, and the very next day, Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England. Harold was not of royal blood. His family had risen to power through service and ambition, not through descent from Alfred or Athelstan, but he was the man on the spot, the strongest lord in England. And the Witan, the Council of Nobles, accepted his claim. Whatever promises had been made to William of Normandy, whatever rights Harold Hardrada believed he possessed, Harold Godwinson wore the crown. He would wear it for less than a year. The threats gathered slowly through the spring and summer. Across the Channel, William assembled an enormous fleet and a powerful army, calling in favors from all over northern France. The Pope himself had blessed his cause, sending a banner to fly over the invasion force. William believed or claimed to believe that Harold had sworn a sacred oath to support his claim to the English throne, and that by taking the crown himself, Harold had committed perjury before God. The invasion was not merely a war of conquest, but a holy crusade. Meanwhile, in Norway, Harold Hardrada gathered his own forces. The Norwegian king was one of the most famous warriors of his age, a giant of a man who had fought his way across half the known world. From the Byzantine Empire to the gates of Sicily, he had no real claim to England. The Danish dynasty had never been Norwegian, but he had ambition and opportunity, and those were enough. Harold Godwinson knew that enemies were coming from both directions, but he could not know when or where they would strike. Through the long summer, he kept his army in the south, watching the Channel, waiting for William's sails to appear on the horizon. His ships patrolled the coast, ready to intercept the Norman fleet. But the wind remained stubbornly unfavorable for a crossing, and as September approached, Harold's provisions began to run low. On September 8th, with no invasion in sight, he was forced to disband his fleet and send his soldiers home to bring in the harvest. Then the news came from the north. Harold Hardrada had landed in Yorkshire with a vast army, joined by Harold's own brother, Tostig, who had turned traitor in a dispute over power. The Vikings had sailed up the rivers and smashed an English army at Fulford Gate. York itself was preparing to surrender. Harold moved with astonishing speed, gathering whatever forces he could. He marched north at a pace that seemed impossible, nearly 200 miles in just 4 or 5 days. On September 25th, he caught the Vikings completely by surprise at Stamford Bridge, east of York. The Norwegians had been waiting to receive hostages from the city, many of them lounging without their armor in the warm September sun. When the English appeared, they barely had time to form a battle line. The fighting was long and bloody. According to the later stories, a single Norwegian warrior held the bridge for hours, cutting down every English soldier who tried to cross, until someone floated beneath the bridge in a barrel and stabbed him from below. But eventually, the English broke through, and the slaughter began. Harold Hardrada fell with an arrow in his throat. Tostig fell beside him. The great Viking army was destroyed so completely that of the 300 ships that had brought them to England, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. It was a triumph beyond anything Harold could have hoped for. The Viking threat that had haunted England for nearly 3 centuries was broken at last, ended forever on the field of Stamford Bridge. But even as Harold celebrated his victory, the wind changed in the Channel. On September 28th, 3 days after the battle, William of Normandy finally set sail for England. Harold received the news on October 1st, and once again he marched, this time south instead of north, gathering forces as he went. He was exhausted. His army was depleted. His best warriors had been killed or wounded at Stamford Bridge. The sensible course would have been to wait, to gather strength, to let William's army wear itself out in hostile territory. But Harold was not a man for waiting. He had defeated one invader through speed and surprise, and he would try to defeat another the same way. On October 14th, the English and Norman armies met at a place later called Battle, on a ridge near the town of Hastings. Harold arranged his forces along the crest of the hill, a dense shield wall of infantry, their shields overlapping, their axes and swords ready to cut down anyone who tried to climb the slope. William's army spread out Bellonerman knights in their coats of mail, archers and crossbowmen, infantry from all over northern France. The battle lasted all day. The Normans charged up the hill again and again and again and again. The English line held. The shield wall bent but did not break. If they could only hold until nightfall, Harold's men believed William would have to retreat and reinforcements would come. But then something changed. A rumor spread that William had been killed, and part of the Norman army began to flee. Some of the English, breaking discipline, rushed down the hill in pursuit. William, very much alive, rallied his men and turned on the pursuers, cutting them down. The tactic worked so well that the Normans began to use feigned retreats deliberately, drawing more and more English soldiers out of the shield wall. Late in the afternoon, Harold was struck by an arrow. The famous image from the Bayeux tapestry shows him clutching at his eye, though historians debate whether this is accurate. What is certain is that, as the sun began to set, the English king fell, and with him fell the hope of England. The shield wall collapsed. The remaining English soldiers fled into the gathering darkness, pursued by Norman cavalry. William stood on the hilltop where Harold had stood that morning, surrounded by the bodies of the fallen, and looked out over his new kingdom. The Anglo-Saxon age was over. In the years that followed, William would transform England utterly. Norman lords replaced English ones. Norman French became the language of the court and the law. The great estates were redistributed to William's followers, and the old English nobility was destroyed so thoroughly that within a generation there were almost no English landowners left. The churches were rebuilt in the heavy Norman style. The towns were reordered. The laws were changed. The very landscape of England was altered to reflect the priorities of its new masters. And yet, the Anglo-Saxons did not simply disappear. Their language survived among the common people, evolving over the centuries, from Old English through Middle English, to become the language you are hearing now. Many of the most basic words we use, mother, father, love, hate, earth, sky, bread, water, Arlo, Anglo-Saxon words, unchanged in essence since the days of Alfred. The days of the week still bear the names of their gods. The shires and counties of England still follow boundaries that were drawn in Anglo-Saxon times. The very idea of England, of a unified kingdom of the English people, is their creation. They are gone now, the Anglo-Saxons. The last of them lived and died 900 years ago. Their bones long since returned to the earth they worked so hard to cultivate. But they left behind a language and a law, a church and a culture, a sense of identity that has endured through all the changes of the centuries. When you speak English, you are speaking their language. When you live in England or in any of the many lands where English is spoken, you are living in a world they helped to shape. Let that thought comfort you as you drift toward sleep. The Anglo-Saxons are part of you now, part of everyone who speaks this language and shares this heritage. Their story is your story, carried forward through the generations, connecting you to men and women who lived in a world utterly different from your own, but who were, in the end, simply human people who loved and feared and hoped and dreamed, who struggled against the darkness and sometimes won. The night is deep now, and the story is done. The ships have landed, the battles have been fought, the kingdoms have risen and fallen, but the legacy endures, written in the words we speak and the names we give to the places we live. The Anglo-Saxons are sleeping now, at peace in the earth they made their home, and so should you be. Rest well, dear listener. Let the long centuries fade away. Let the weight of history lift from your shoulders. Let your mind float free in the quiet darkness. The story will still be here tomorrow, waiting for you whenever you want to return. Good night, and thank you for listening.